Hello, I am here in Seattle today visiting with some Wilfred Bion scholars, so it's perfect for me to make this talk today about Wilfred Bion. Wilfred Bion's status in the current world of group psychotherapy, I'd say, is controversial. On one hand, a margin of group psychotherapists talk about him all the time. His work can be found in Europe in the work of Malcolm Pines, in America, Richard Billow, over and over. They return to his work over and over. And then at the same time, if you review kind of contemporary books on group psychotherapy, you may see no mention of his name. Despite that, he kind of pioneered ideas that have taken hold really in industrial organizational psychology, some social psychology, and despite his name being either absent, I think potentially because people disliked what he said at times, or people aren't familiar with the history of group, to not know his work is being remiss in the history of group psychotherapy. So, Bion's experiences as a young officer in England, he was English, in World War I, really stirred his interest in group dynamics. How do people organize and how do people work together? And as soldiers returned from World War I with shell-shocked, what we might call today PTSD, he's tried to understand how to help these people return to their kind of previous life in some way. Bion went through extended personal kind of psychoanalytic treatments. He worked with John Rickman and Melanie Klein, both of kind of object relations fame. And then he also kind of worked closely with Sigmund Folks, who we'll talk about, and Patrick Demar, who kind of started Large Group. So when World War II started, Bion, although older in his 50s, joined the English Army. He felt passionate about fighting Hitler's imperialism, fascism, genocide. But he was difficult to work with. He was often outspoken, very pompous, and he had a certain air of suspiciousness about him, and people often kind of viewed him with suspiciousness also. One of the famous stories of Bion in World War II was as a psychiatrist, they wanted to figure out who would be best in various ways of positions in World War II. So where the U.S. Army kind of did quantitative tests, like the alpha tests that you will study, I'm sure, in assessment, Bion liked this idea of watching people in experiential exercises. So he would take a group of people together, enlisted soldiers, bring them out to a field with some tools, an axe, a saw, some rope, some nails, a hammer. And he was an officer, and he would say, I need you all to build a bridge across this river as quickly as possible. And then he would sit down in a chair and not respond from that point forward. People would say, are we allowed to cut down trees? Are we allowed to tie ropes? Can we break into teams? Do we all need to work together? He would watch how people worked. Who tried to take charge? Who did people listen to? Who split people into teams and make things work quicker and split the workload? Who needed everyone to be together at every moment? We all probably have some aspects of all of these in our own work groups of how we like things to do. But he felt that through watching people, who people followed, who could work independently, who could kind of check in with other groups to make sure they were working simultaneously in ways that would match. This produced the best way to see who would be the best officers, who may be the best kind of engineers, who might be exceptional at strategy, who might be the best medics in some way. But when soldiers returned from World War II, there was a dramatic increase in group psychotherapy. In some way, out of the horrors of the war, group psychotherapy blossomed. There was many widows, orphans, soldiers with trauma, as well as a general population from being bombed in England who was very scared, extremely anxious, having a wide degree of what might be seen as psychological symptoms, from panic attacks to disassociation to depression and withdrawal to maybe more kind of existential, humanistic, transpersonal issues, a loss of hope, a loss of meaning, a loss of faith, a loss of their spirituality. So what Bion did was he helped develop a theory, along with others such as Patrick de Marais, who we talked about, of people sitting in groups and talking mainly about their here and now experiences. At this moment I'm feeling, for instance, at this moment I'm feeling anxious because nobody's saying anything. At this moment I'm feeling angry because there's multiple conversations going on. And they experimented with these groups of 4, 6, 8, 20, 50, 100. They do large community groups. One of the most important, although it was very short-lived, kind of treatment centers and experiments after World War II was in the Northfield Hospital, where they brought various people in to try to get intensive psychotherapy, which they'd get every day, nutrition, walks. And Bion was there for about 6 weeks with Sigmund Folks. During this time, they experimented with different sizes of group, and they began to have this idea that people acted differently in depending on the size of the group. In dyads, people seemed to have more safety and trust. As the group got larger, people seemed to get a little more agitated. And that as the group became larger still, kind of the family of origin dynamics that would arise in, say, a group of 6 to 8 would fall away, and kind of more of the social themes, social feelings, social roles that people would take would kind of be highlighted more. Now, Bion's ideas are fairly intricate and not really easily accessible. His classic book is Experiences in Groups, and it's a wonderful read. It's very short. It's only about 150 pages. Maybe one of you might want to read that and write one of your papers on Bion as you go through the course. But in that book, Bion was working at the Tavistock Clinic, which is a very famous clinic in London. And groups were very new, so he would sit down and he would say, okay, let's begin. And he would sit there silently, and people would say, well, tell us what to do. And then he would say, okay, I think you should talk about what you're feeling right now. And then the group would rebel and say, well, we don't want to talk about that. What else can we talk about? And he said, well, why don't you talk about your life histories a little bit? And the group would rebel and say, they don't want to talk about this either. I've read the book multiple times, and I'm still unsure how much of it is kind of this English dry wit that he's putting in there, and how much of it is just his best ability to scientifically describe what is going on. But I, having led groups and had this experience of no matter what I've done as a leader being the wrong thing, I couldn't help but laugh out loud as he described his early experiences of trying to lead groups. So he has many, many ideas, but he thought that all groups kind of were a split between what would be called the work group, the work of the group, and the basic assumptions group. So every group has some form of work. When I worked at UPS in various roles, as a truck driver, as a package loader, as a sorter, as unloading the tractor trailers, we had a work that needed to happen, which is basically to get packages out and to get packages delivered. As sometimes things would interfere with our work. There'd be dynamics between our supervisors, there would be dynamics between employees, and things wouldn't happen. So he kind of tried to codify some of these interference in getting work done in groups. He very strongly saw groups from two perspectives. One of that as the individuals, but also very much one of those as a group as a whole, that a group has its own life, its own personality, its own unexplicit norms. So he felt that there was kind of three basic elements. We've talked about some of the drive theorists and some of the early personality theorists in here, with Freud first thinking about the pleasure principle, moving on to Thanatos, Klein talking about relationships. For Bion, these kind of three root elements, some of these coming out of working with Klein, who kind of reformatted Freud's idea, was a kind of drive of love, that people had altruism in them. Secondarily, they also had kind of hate and aggression in them, and these were often at conflict. But it wasn't just dyadic. There's kind of a third drive, a third state of consciousness, so to speak, that he would call curiosity or knowing. And then he would codify his groups. So he would put, when he'd listen to audio tapes of his groups or recount them, and he'd put the letter L for love, or H for hate, or K for curiosity or knowing, as he reviewed the groups and tried to understand what went into what in terms of group development. He found that groups were always resistant to talking about various things, and often kind of resistant from embodying and exploring these three drives. And when this would happen, he would kind of code these drives with a minus sign. If you look at some Bion scholars, you'll see letters and symbols. It can be very confusing, not quite like Lacan, but pretty confusing. He felt this kind of resistance, he called this the beta function. And then he'd call the alpha function was a process when these beta elements, things that were being avoided, would somehow be named, would find meaning, would become understandable or symbolic. I think I was in a Bion-oriented group once where the group was talking about its shoes endlessly. Boots, dress shoes, sneakers, and the leader kept coming back to the metaphor of shoes and what were we trying to say in what was seemingly very kind of superficial conversation about shoes in some way. And I think we went on to talk about what was in our consciousness. People wearing combat boots. This was early 2000s, the dangers of the war, America being somewhat imperialistic in the Middle East in some way, some people wanting to relax, people wearing running shoes, wanting to run away. In some way, in that group, that would be seen as kind of taking the beta elements and turning them into alpha elements by somehow trying to understand these. So basically, Bion felt that what groups did is they tried to move kind of these vague, unconscious, somatic, imagery-driven, kind of inexpressible, what he called proto-mental states that would be acted out and disowned if they weren't brought into discussion, into consciousness in some way. So he would kind of work to help people bring darkness to light, or the invisible visible, very psychoanalytic in this way. And he used the term valency to talk about how willing members were to engage in this process. I think it's vital, and this idea of valency continues to be although the word is used different, they kind of use motivation or engagement these days, continues to be perhaps at least one of the most essential ingredients, I think, to a successful group. That when members want to get better, I led many groups with people recovering from addiction. And at times I'd go back and forth, and I'd split people into groups based on their levels of motivation for sobriety. So I'd put people who were highly motivated in one group, and then people who seemed less motivated or were kind of recovering for their partner or their family or their job in a different group. Using Bion's theories about this, the resistances to achieving their sobriety that the first group wanted was better able to get talked about and explored. They don't know how to do it. This is their main way of managing stress throughout their lives. And then in the B group, in the other group of people less motivated, it was almost took on an element of, say, motivational interviewing, of looking at the change language and jumping on that. Like, oh, you would like to make more money, although it may not be about addiction, that in some way trying to get people to find their motivation for what they want, as those groups were very defiant often and felt very pressured into it. So overall, Bion's style was generally passive. He'd use what you'll come to learn as a group as a whole intervention. So he'd address the whole group. This might be, if we're talking about shoes, it seems like the group is talking about shoes. He'd often talk very briefly. Sometimes he would say a little more than that. It seems like the group is also talking about shoes. I wonder why shoes, or I wonder what we're avoiding talking about if we're not talking about shoes in some way. I want to talk a little bit about his kind of basic assumption ideas. So he had three basic ideas. The first was this idea of dependency, that groups felt very dependent upon the leader. It was up to the leader to create movement, direction, structure in the groups, and that groups will move from doing the task to kind of a movement towards dependency upon the leader. So, I mean, I could look at this in terms of my work at UPS. At times, we would want more clarity from our leader about what the workload may look like that evening, when we may be done, whether we'll have overtime, whether we'll be shifting out of unloading the tractor trailers into sorting packages and moving over, and then kind of some ideas about pacing. Will we be there for 6 hours or 12 hours today? I could also kind of look at it in psychotherapy groups. As you get together, people want to know, what are we doing here? Are we talking about our feelings? Are we talking about our cognitions? And what are we trying to accomplish? Are we mainly sharing here and now experiences with the hope that this will bring the then and there or unconscious to light? So in my experience, no matter how great of detail a leader can go into in addressing this early dependency, it never meets it fully. Inevitably, groups are full of frustration, confusion, and so this, although Bion considered dependency one of his three basic assumptions, that groups would move away from work towards a dependency on the leader, they would also kind of go through a stage of counterdependency, which would mean against the leader, potentially against the group in some way, as kind of talked about later on in maybe Nitson's anti-group which would also be a wonderful paper for someone to write. So after this idea of dependency, which often comes first, although there's some argument about the developmental or progressive nature of these basic assumptions. Kind of a second basic assumption that would occur would be this fight-flight, that people in the group would either start fighting with one another, fighting with the leader, fighting to overthrow the leader by changing the rules and structures of the group in some way, and or flight, talk about other things outside the room, and up to actually leaving the group at times, people leaving prematurely. It's something that happens fairly frequently, more frequently than you would think in a variety of psychotherapy groups, whether they are court-ordered or held by an agency or in private practice in some way. And then the third stage that Bion talked about was pairing. This idea that people would come together and kind of unconsciously elect two people in the group to do the primary work of the group. I think you'll see this a lot in your groups and even in your work groups. When I've been in various faculty meetings or task groups of national organizations about groups, there'll be two people who will do the majority of the talking, often from different views, and they might be speaking for a subgroup. I was just recently writing an article with a large group of people, and there was someone who spoke very passionately that it must be very short, 15 pages or less. And then there was someone else who argued very vehemently that it must be thorough and we can't be tied down to length to do an excellent job. And they said if it takes 60 pages, it takes 60 pages. And they went back and forth, and the group sat there and just watched. And it's a group of group psychotherapists trying to get a task done. And someone said something that was very typical in a group of a group therapists. They said, "Excuse me, I'd like to make a process comment at this moment. I think the group is locked in a pairing dynamic." And that's group psychotherapy humor. Everyone laughed because it was true. And then we expanded it out to try to have more voices talk about what should happen. Then we ended up falling into a separate pairing dynamic of the tone of the article. There was one person speaking very vehemently and passionately that the tone must be readable. We want to write this so our grandfathers could understand what we're saying, even if they've never gone to high school or college. And there was someone else that said, no, it must really be thorough. We must cite it. We must use the most contemporary language. We shouldn't limit what we need to say by our audience. And this went on for another 10 or 15 minutes. And someone said, excuse me, I'd like to make a process comment. And the group kind of yelled out pairing in some way. So these were very experienced group leaders and group members who kind of had this experience. So I want to say something else about pairing here. There's an idea here that this is mythic in some way, and that a group pair sometimes gets compared to Mary and Joseph, the parents of Christ, that one might be seen as holy and blessed, and someone else might be seen as very loyal and altruistic. And there's a hope here is that somehow this pair in the group might give birth to a symbolic or languaging Jesus, or a holy idea that will help the group understand what's going on, what it's working towards, kind of this Bion idea of K. What is the knowing that can come from this group? So I think I'll end on a little conversations I've had. I do So I'm teaching with students in Asia, particularly in China, and then I have multiple colleagues over there in China. So they were having a 5-day Tavistock group in Singapore that I knew about. So I told all my colleagues in China, my students and my colleagues, if you've never experienced a Tavistock group, you should really experience a Tavistock group. So Tavistock comes out of this English model where I talked about Bion wrote the experiences in group from his experiences there after World War II. But basically the leader makes just group as a whole interventions, and the goal of the group is not psychotherapeutic. The goal of the group is to understand group processes. So a typical Tavistock group, a leader may sit down, put their hands on their lap, sit up straight, and start immediately on time. Boundaries are extremely important, and say something along the lines of, the goal of this group is to understand its unfolding process. And then the group will go on for 90 minutes, and people will start fighting, arguing, saying, what do you want? What do you want to do here? Where should we have lunch? Might talk about politics. It might break into multiple small conversations. People may leave. And then usually after about 90 minutes, the group leader, who's been sitting completely silently, will say something along the lines of, this group is off task. And in doing so, remind the group that it's not exploring, it's kind of unfolding process. So I invited my friends to go to this Tavistock group being held in Singapore, and then I got the report back earlier this week where they said it was a completely horrible experience. People were screaming and yelling at each other. People were making personal insults to each other about what they dressed, what their appearance was, their accents, their levels of education, the cars they drove to the workshop, where they could afford to go to lunch, that it turned into an unbelievable feuding, fighting, destructive experience, and that nobody said anything about this. And each day more and more people left. The group started at 30. The second day it was down to 25. People didn't return from lunch. It ended with about 15 people there, which they thought was higher because almost everyone wanted to leave. But it's just kind of this piety and allegiance to leaders and experts in that culture they felt that kept people from leaving there. And they said that the leaders basically said very, very little, just held the frame in the container, started on time, ending on time. So I'm hesitant to recommend to you all then that if you haven't done a Tavistock experience, you should go do one. But perhaps you could do one for one day, and perhaps you could email me or other people you know in the group field about who may be a good leader of leading a Tavistock group. It reminds me of one of my favorite group interventions I've ever experienced as a member, which was at a 2-day workshop, and the leader sat down and said, let's begin. And the group began, and then about 90 minutes passed, and the group leader, she said, like elk rutting their horns. And we all looked at her and said, what the hell does that mean? What are you talking about? And in that Tavistock style, the leader didn't say anything. But the group took up that leader's question at that point. And we started to see that we were talking about various 5K times, 10K time, who had done a marathon, how full people's private practices were, who was teaching at the most prestigious university. In some way, competition was running rampant in that group, and that we were totally unconscious of it and just getting caught up in the group zeitgeist or wind of competition. So that was and we took that up when we saw why are we doing that. We looked at the competition in ourselves. We explored, if we wanted to spend our time together just competing with one another, or if we wanted to get to know one another and start relating with one another instead of dominating one another. So that'd be a different kind of group as a whole intervention from a Tavistock experience that I found very, very powerful, although the group leader was very, very passive. So I think this was an awful lot to digest. Bion is very complex. Group as a whole is something that many people have a very hard time wrapping their heads around, that they like to feel that they're always individuals in charge of themselves, making decisions, and they're not getting caught up in the energy of the group and losing their consciousness. I actually think mindfulness practice helps to not do that, but I think the power of the group is very, very profound. So I look forward to your thoughts or questions about Bion, and we'll go on and we'll talk a little bit more about some other things that was happening after World War II in group psychotherapy. And take care now. Bye-bye.